Hola, buenas tardes a todos. Vamos a esperar unos segundos para que se vaya uniendo más personas. Os recuerdo que este webinar va a ser en inglés y no hay traducción simultánea. Bienvenidos a un nuevo a un nuevo webinar de la Fundación Innovación Bankinterr. Damos unos segundos más para que se una más gente que se están uniendo en este momento. Okay, let's start. Welcome to a new webinar of the Bankinterr Innovation Foundation. I'm Marce Cancho, and today we are going to talk with Marc Post about alternative proteins. This webinar is the result of the last meeting of our Think Tank Future Trends Forum that we held last November. We brought together 40 experts, including Marc, to discuss how we will feed 10 billion people in a healthy and sustainable way in 2050. As you can imagine, we are facing a significant challenge. Energy, climate, and water resources crisis demand an urgent and coordinated action. At the forum, the experts highlighted key points like regenerative agriculture, alternative proteins, efficient water management, advances in AI and big data for soil health, ecological practices, and the need for a global collaboration. This is a challenge that requires a collective change involving all ecosystem actors like regulators, educators, academia, the food industry, consumers, investors, and startups. Feeding the world sustainably requires a transformation of how we produce and consume our food. Today, we have here with us Marc. Welcome, Marc, to a new webinar with us. It's a real pleasure and an honor to have you today with us. Marc is a physiologist and a vascular biologist who is the best known for his work on cultured meat. He's the co-founder of Maastricht University's Mosamid project, which is in 2013 produced the world's first hamburger patty grown from cultured feed cells. In addition to his work on cultured meat, Marc has also conducted research on alternative protein sources, such as insects and algae. So, Marc, welcome. And Marc is going to give his speech during half an hour, more or less, and then you can write your questions at the bottom on question and answers, so we can open the discussion and debate with Marc. So thank you, Marc.
Yeah, thanks, Marcy, for the introduction, and thank you all for joining. Let me share my screen. So yes, feeding the world is a complex problem, and it's going to be increasingly complex, going from our current population to whatever the population is going to be, 9 or 10 billion, with also increasing demands for instance, animal proteins, not alternative proteins, but animal proteins. And it will be not only a challenge, it will actually impossible to do that with the current production systems. And at the forum that Marcia just discussed, we identified a number of issues with the food system that are, in our eyes, the most pressing issues. One is obviously unequal distribution, a big part of the population not having enough to eat and a large part of the population having too much. There is a lot of waste during production and during consumption. About 40% of all the food that we produce, and this is a conservative estimate, is wasted and does not go into consumption. There are a number of efficiencies, and I will talk about one of them being animal proteins, which is really an efficient way, a lovely way, but an efficient way to feed a population. And then finally, of course, there is the environmental impact of our agricultural system that contributes to the unsustainability of our food production system. So As I mentioned, there's an increasing demand for animal proteins. And you might wonder, well, we don't see that in our part of the world, and that's true. In the Western Europe and even in the US, meat consumption is relatively stable, but that's not the same for the rest of the world. In China and India, and at some point also in Africa, meat consumption is, or animal protein consumption is on the rise, has been on the rise for the last 30 years, and will continue to be on the rise for at least the next 25 years, according to the FAO, to a degree that in 2050, we will need 70% more. That's almost double the animal protein production that we currently have. And considering that animal proteins are an extremely resource inefficient or resource intense part of our diet, consuming 80% of all our agricultural land, 20% of fresh water use, and that leads to a contribution to greenhouse gas emission that is a staggering 14 to 15%. So it has a tremendous impact on our environment and on our resources. And why is that? That's mostly because if you see animals as an intermediate between plant-based proteins that are part of their diet, think about grass for cows, into animal proteins that are part of our diet, in between, we lose a lot of calories, a lot of protein calories. And for cows, for instance, we lose 85% of those calories. So having the cow as an intermediate is, in a way, a very inefficient way to produce meat or animal proteins. Now here, this is a study that was not done not too long ago, where sort of a compound environmental impact of our food system has been assembled, and it's a combination of global warming potential, land use, water use, fine particle matter, human toxicity, and a couple of other components. And the higher the bar, the bigger the impact on the environment is. And invariably, in all those life cycle analysis studies, beef and dairy proteins come out worst. They have by far the biggest impact on the environment. And that's because of their inefficiency, and also because they're ruminants. They emit methane, and methane is a very powerful greenhouse gas. Now you see that in the middle, we see chicken and pork. So that's a lot better because these animals are a lot more efficient. And on the far left, the least impact on the environment of all the proteins that we consume are actually plant-based proteins. There's no question about that. Now you see here already kind of preemptively two entries called CM. This is cultivated, this is cultivated meat. That's the technology I'm going to talk a little bit about. And there are two entries here. One says conventional and one sustainable. And this refers to the amount of energy that you would use to make such a product. If it's fossil fuel based, the environmental impact is somewhere between pork and beef. If it's renewable energy sources, it's somewhere between chicken and plant-based proteins. It's never as good as plant-based proteins. Let's be very clear about that. So the wise thing to do from an environmental aspect, and also, as I will show, from a health aspect, is that we all become vegetarians. This is entirely possible. We all grew up with the myth, well, not maybe all, but most of us grew up with the myth that animal proteins are necessary for you. And they're really not. There are on this planet 2 billion vegetarians. They're decreasing in number, and because they are typically involuntarily vegetarian, but nevertheless they thrive and they survive. So it's perfectly possible with a vegetarian diet to have a healthy and good life. And even, this is a very boring slide, I apologize for that, but here, this is a analysis of 20 studies or so, having compared protein diet with an animal protein diet, and its effect on cholesterol, the bad cholesterol that clogs your arteries. And everything that's to the left of the line says plant-based is better than animal protein, and on the right, animal protein is better. And overall, you see here that indeed, if you are vegetarian, your risk of cardiovascular disease is reduced. It's not a big effect, but it's reduced nonetheless. So we have to agree that, at least from a cardiovascular health point of view, a vegetarian diet is better. Now, one of the organizations that spent a lot of energy, and that, by the way, they were also at the forum of the Bankinterr Foundation, is the Eat Forum organization. And what they are doing is they have an interesting perspective of how to look at our diet. They want to combine planetary health with human health. So they want to find a balance between those two propositions. And they recently came out with a new edition of their report. Initially, they said, well, indeed, animal proteins are not necessary, and they are not necessarily good for us, and they are definitely not good for the planet. But quite recently, they came up with a new edition where they kind of acknowledge that a very limited amount of animal proteins in our diet actually could be helpful on a global perspective. And this is an important aspect, that the availability of food is an important health aspect, of course. And if you have a small amount of animal proteins available, the chance that your diet is complete is just higher than when it's based on a vegetable diet. So that's not for people in our environment. We can pick and choose any vegetable or any legume or pulse that we can think of. But in large parts of the world, that's not the case. So they advocate a small amount. Now, this is very small. This is 200 grams per week. So that's a very small amount of animal protein. So actually going to a more plant-based diet makes a ton of sense. Unfortunately, there are now a couple of trends that show that this is not an easy transition. We saw in the United States 2 companies coming up, Beyond Meat and Impossible, and they had a tremendous growth in the beginning, and also a tremendous economic growth in the beginning. Because what they essentially did for the first time is they offered these plant-based meat substitutes, initially hamburgers, to meat eaters. These products have been around for a very long time, as we all know, in Europe, but they usually catered to vegetarians and vegans. But now they have started to cater to meat eaters. And that saw, because of the novelty, a big increase in sales and in consumption of plant-based products, and everybody was extremely happy. However, in the US, we have seen a big backlash. To the extent here you see the quarterly growth, year-on-year growth of Beyond Meat, and you see that actually it's shrinking. And this, by the way, has not happened in Europe yet, and I don't think it actually will happen in Europe. But in the US, this has happened, and one of the biggest producers of vegetarian foods, the Tattooed Chef, actually has gone bankrupt. So in the US now, there is a sentiment that it's a lost cause, plant-based meat substitutes. I don't think it is, but that's currently the sentiment, and that also has translated into a lot of investments in these companies going down. By the way, a similar thing happens on the beverage front with milk proteins. Not as dramatic, but somewhat similar. Now, one interesting study also on this slide is it says top 10 reasons why households would purchase alternative meat or alternative proteins. And interestingly, and somewhat unexpectedly maybe, the highest driver for going for alternative proteins is just variety. People want variety, and that's quite recognizable, I think. All of us living in what I call a decadent part of society, we are used to variety. And so having a new product on the market will actually drive sales. The problem with the whole thing, the whole concept of plant-based meat substitutes is that, I love meat, and most people do. 95% of the people love meat and are not disciplined enough to become vegetarian. So is there another way to produce that product without the environmental impact? And that's why we came up with the principle of cultivated meat, which is a very simple principle to make exactly the same product that we are used to. And it's grown from also the same cells that typically grow meat in a cow, being muscle cells and fat cells. And the technology is, at least in my mind, relatively simple. You take a biopsy from a cow, just 0.5 gram. You separate the muscle cells from the fat cells. There are technologies to do that. And then you let them proliferate. You let them divide many, many times, and they can do that quite efficiently. And since these are dedicated muscle and fat stem cells, you can let them produce muscle tissue and fat tissue outside of the body. That's a system called tissue engineering. It has been around in the medical technology for quite some time, but we started to apply this for food back in 2010, so almost 14 years ago now. And indeed, if you do that, you can eventually make a hamburger, and that's what we did, as Marcy said, in 2013. Now, in 2013, there were still some animal proteins in there, so we had to get rid of them. And one particularly public compound, if you like, at least a compound that got public attention, is that typically you use a blood component to grow cells outside of the body. So we had to get rid of that, and we developed what you call a serum-free medium to let them grow outside of the body without blood components. So that's not difficult to do, but you have to spend time and money and resources on it. You also want to be very efficient, right? We want to be more efficient than a cow. That's the whole point of it. So initially, these kind of artistic pictures, if you like, show muscle cells, and they coincidentally have the same color, but that's a coincidence. But you see all these swirls of muscle fibers and the structure that you typically have in a muscle. And initially, only 50% of these cells actually made those muscle cells. And currently, we are at 95%. So we gradually make it more and more efficient, which is necessary. It's living tissue. This is actually the only video that the sound is kind of not important, but it's living tissue, and the muscle actually exercises so that it creates a real muscle tissue. And that leads to a protein composition and a protein content that is very similar to muscle that you get out of a supermarket. So here on the left, we have minced meat coming out of a supermarket, and on the right we have a couple of our samples with a protein content that is quite similar. Of course, meat is not only muscle, it's also fat, and fat actually contributes a lot to the product, if you like, because it's a taste, it's a cook. Well, I don't have to explain to Spanish people how fat is important for jamon. So I don't really have to do that. But also for beef fat, you can actually culture that. And here on top, you see 3 tissues, if you like. On the right is fat that we took straight from a cow. In the middle is the fat that we have cultured. And on the left, we have a gel that the fat cells are actually in when we grow it to form a tissue. And then what is important, but it's a little bit a difficult picture, is here in the middle, these color-coded bars. This actually shows the composition of the fat. Fat is a very complex product. Doesn't seem to be, but it actually is. It's a very complex product. It contains of many, many different fatty acids of chain lengths varying from 16 carbon atoms to 22 carbon atoms, and with different levels of saturation. That's why we call things saturated fatty acids and unsaturated fatty acids. And every color here represents a fatty acid. And the right two bars give a fat that we take right from a cow, either out of the muscle tissue or out of subcutaneous fat. And on the left, you see the left three bars are the fat that we are growing over time from day 0 to day 28. And you see that gradually that fat matures into a fat that has exactly the same composition, not exactly the same, but roughly the same composition as fat that we take out of the cow. And I say not exactly the same because quite serendipitously, the unsaturated fatty acid component in our cultured fat is already a little bit higher than in cow fat. So this is this would be a completely different way of making meat. And from a technical point of view, this requires a lot of fermentation capacity. That when you grow those cells in big numbers, that's very, very similar to a fermentation process if you make single cell proteins from fungi or from like corn. And so you would have to think of, well, what does that actually mean if you want to replace the entire meat production by cows and other animals with meat production through fermentation. And that requires a total increase of our fermentation capacity of a factor 1.5. That's a tremendous effort, but it's not undoable. The other thing, and you may remember that back in 2013, when we presented the hamburger as kind of a gimmick, I said, well, this little baby cost us 250,000 euro, which actually was true. But of course, it's a rather nonsensical number at that point in time. But you have to eventually make this into a commodity that replaces meat, and therefore it has to be cheap. And we have seen tremendous reduction in cost because of the technology, but also by sourcing our ingredients in a different way. Remember, this is a medical technology to start with. And so initially, all our ingredients were pharma grade. And there's a funny story on the web where somebody calculated if you make chocolate chip cookies with pharma grade ingredients, and then 25 cookies would also cost $30,000. So we have to gradually replace those pharma grade ingredients with food or feed grade ingredients. And this is, again, somewhat of a boring slide, and it's also not easily understandable, but on the bottom, we have 8 or 7 protein hydrolysates. These are proteins taken from wheat, from cotton, from guar, from peas, and they are hydrolyzed in different ways. The color coding of the different bars refers to different ways of hydrolyzing them. And what we did here, we gave the cells a feed where no amino acids, no building blocks of proteins were present whatsoever. And we added these hydrolysates that are very, very cheap and very easy to make. And you see that at 100%, basically the effect of the hydrolysate is the same as the original pharma grade amino acid rich medium. So you see that some of those protein sources, some of these hydrolysates actually can function as a amino acid and protein building block for the animal proteins in those cells. Now, this seems somewhat obvious, but in cell culture land, in biomedical cell culture land, this is a revolution. People never thought this would work because cells are fragile, they don't have digestive systems, so they never thought this would work, but it does, and quite well, actually. Now, of course, with all the alternative proteins, but maybe especially with insects, for instance, but also with cultivated meat, there is not an immediate obvious acceptance of that product. It's man-made, it's in a lab, some call it Frankenstein food, and not understanding and not realizing that it's essentially the same thing, just made in a different way. So a lot of explanation has to be done, and a lot of education has to be done, and gradually, I believe these products will, when they enter the market, will be accepted. And I have two reasons to think that. One is that we actually do see, actually do see over time that people respond to it in a more positive way than back in 2011 when we started to ask questions to people about these products. And that gradually has seen an increase in acceptance. And the other is the realization that eventually we as consumers are able to eat a lot of stuff that we actually don't know how it's made or what it's made of. So it seems somewhat weird, but eventually we can accept, once we trust it and see that it's safe for you, that we can accept actually a lot of different food items. And I use in the US usually the example of a hot dog. Nobody knows if you ask what is in a hot dog. Nobody understands how it's being made, yet it's a highly accepted and appreciated product. So the alternative protein industry as a whole, but cultivated meat also, has gone through a tremendous growth. Of course, they came from nothing, so it's still a small volume, but they have gone through a tremendous growth. There are now worldwide 160 companies, and every couple of months, 10 more companies show up. Some are working on pork, some on chicken, some are fish, and some on beef, and some on technologies that are kind of complementary and supportive. And a couple of those companies are now starting to scale up production. This is a tough thing to do. From a technical point of view, it's somewhat tough, but it's doable, but also because you still have to balance those high costs of ingredients, which are going down rapidly, but still are on the high side, with scaling up. And of course, most of the companies had to wait for regulatory approval. This is a novel food. In the EU, it's a novel food, and in most other geographies, it's also regulated as a novel food. That means that producers have to prove that this is safe before it can be entered, before it can be admitted to the market. And we have seen, fortunately, in the last 3 years or so, a number of approvals. It started back in 2020 in Singapore with a chicken product. 2 years ago, 2 products were approved in the US, and more are coming. This year, early this year, a product got approved in Israel and one in Australia. So gradually, this is coming, but also that took a while and delayed things to a certain degree. One aspect that I just want to mention is initially we thought, and a lot of other people thought, that this would disrupt a lot of traditional farming and traditional agriculture and would cost a lot of jobs. And actually from the early on, we started to engage with farmers to see, okay, how can we how can we understand what is going to happen here, and how can we get you involved into this process? And that has culminated into an organization called Respect Farms, where together with farmers, they're trying to design sort of the farm of the future, where maybe along some traditional farming and for sure crop farming, cultivated meat can be produced at small scale in a farm. So we're trying to develop that story, and for sure, farmers are interested. In countries like the Netherlands, farmers are under a lot of pressure. The current policy of the government is to buy out 2,000 farmers in this country because they are too close to Nature 2000 areas. So everybody is looking for alternatives, and this also could be a way out for them. And I think this is the final. Oh no, this is the how fast is this going to happen? When is this going to be on the market as a mass product, let's say in supermarkets? And of course, for that, the production needs to be scaled up and the cost needs to come down. So we don't really have a lot of ways of knowing how this is going to develop. But consultancy companies like A.T. Kearney has done some predictions on the basis of a lot of analyses and surveys. And they expect actually, and the trend I think is true, the timing may be off. They expect that in about 15 years from now, about 50% of all the meat consumption will be replaced by alternative proteins. And this will be plant-based, and this will be cultivated, and maybe single cell proteins or precision fermentation products. But they think it will happen relatively fast. Now, the timing may be off. It may not be 40 years, or it may not be 15 years, but it may be 20 years or 25. But I do believe that eventually we will go to a more plant-based and alternative protein diet, because there's basically no plan B. We cannot continue with animal protein production and consumption the way we are doing. And it's up to consumers to pick and choose. Do I go for plant-based? Do I go for insects or for cultivated meat? Or and therefore all these alternatives have to be developed and have to be presented to consumers to see what our way out of the animal meat production issue is going to be. And with that, I would like to conclude. Thank you for listening, and I'm happy to entertain questions, and I will stop sharing my screen.
Okay, thank you so much, Mark, for your, this is very impressive, because you have give us a full picture of what's going on around cultivate meat. So, which is very impressive. I mean,
Thank you.
I was thinking that 10 years ago, when you started and you founded Mosamid, what did you find there? What was the idea to bring you and to try to found this startup?
Well, really, I have, and we as a company have been driven by the environmental impact. That's the most important part for us. And of course, there are a couple of other benefits, but environment is really on the forefront of our sort of wish for impact.
Okay. So here I have some more questions from the audience. I believe meat consumption was declining. What do you think would be the reason? What do you think would be the reason for the increase in meat consumption?
Well, so if you believe that meat consumption is declining, maybe you're looking at your own environment or, Spain or the Netherlands, for instance. And in fact, even then, we think it's declining, but if you look at the numbers, it's not really impressive. And in fact, if you have a good barbecue season, it goes up again. So it is quite a fragile decline, if you like. Globally, quite the opposite is the case, and that's because people who become more wealthy in China and India and in Africa start to consume meat, and that's where the biggest increase for meat consumption is going to come from. If everybody in Spain becomes vegetarian, still global meat consumption will increase.
Yeah, so another one. Are there vegetable protein initiatives to give them the flavors and textures of meat? And are they really good?
They're getting better and better. Flavor is relatively easy to mimic. The big flavor companies know how to do that. There's one issue with some plant-based proteins where if you process the proteins, they give off bitter off notes and they are difficult to mask. So that's a particular problem. Structure is very, very difficult. To get a structure of, let's say a jamón will be extremely tough. People have tried for 30, 35 years. And that's why for hamburgers or for sausages, it's relatively easy. But for things like jamón or steaks, or ribeyes, it's tough.
Okay. Do you comparative analysis of course between cultural plant and meat?
Yeah, we do. And in fact, what we see now, I haven't spoken about that, but what we see now is a lot of blended products where part of the product is a plant-based protein and part of the product is a cultivated protein, just for taste and texture. So, for instance, if you cultivate fat, it's a little bit of a technical story, but if you cultivate fat, the fat is naturally encapsulated. And that leads to a cooking behavior and a retention of fat and water in the product that adds to the juiciness. And of course, it also, the fat, as you've seen, the composition is quite similar. It creates the taste without needing to add additional flavoring. So, and the plant-based proteins are quite nice as a protein filler, if you like, because they are very, very cheap. So to get to relatively cheap products in the beginning that combine the better of the two, those blended products will likely be the first to enter the market.
Okay, thank you. One more question. I would like to have some idea about the content in essential fatty acids and amino acids in this cultural meat. He is a basic biochemist. Sorry.
Right. Right. No, but it's a very good question. And the nutritional value obviously is important, both from a bioavailability point of view, but also just a compositional point of view. What are the amino acids in there? Now, the animal proteins have typically a slightly more complete amino acid profile than most vegetable proteins have. And this is not different for cultivated meat. Some of the compounds, it's not so much amino acids and not so much fatty acids. They are fine. They are well represented. Specific proteins like myoglobin. Myoglobin is the protein that turns meat red, and it also adds to the taste. But from a nutritional value point of view, importantly, it provides a particular kind of iron that is good for us. So I'm simplifying, but it's otherwise it becomes too technical, I think. But it provides a particular kind of iron that is good for us. Now, it's hard to get the sufficient amount of myoglobin in that cultivated meat. We are roughly at the level of pork. So not at the level of beef, but at the level of pork. So it's in there, but it's not quite at the level of beef. And that still requires optimization. Other components, and a famous one is vitamin B12. We are dependent on vitamin B12. We need it in our diet. And traditionally, meat is a good source of vitamin B12. You can get vitamin B12 in other ways, but meat is a very good source of vitamin B12. This is not made by cows. Cows don't make vitamin B12. No mammal makes vitamin B12. It's a bacterial product. So the cows get it from bacteria, and then it's stored in the meat, and then we eat it and we get it in our diet. So we have to add vitamin B12 to the feed of the cells to be able to, for the cultivated product to have vitamin B12 in there, as much as the cow has to have bacteria to get vitamin B12 in their meat.
Okay. Is the insect processing food a real alternative to cultivate meat?
I would think so. From a purely scientific and technological point of view and nutritional point of view, it is. There's no question. And the insect providers have provided all that data. There's no question. There are a couple of issues with insect proteins, though. One is acceptance. It's just harder to get people to accept insect proteins. And actually, worldwide, insect protein consumption is declining because it's a poor man's food traditionally. The other is that there is the taste. It does have a specific taste, and people need to get accustomed to it either, or they will never get accustomed to it, and they will not like it. So it does have a it's an acquired taste, I should say.
Okay. One more question. Florida has just banned of growing cultivated meat in Florida. What do you think about this?
Yeah,
And I know for sure that other countries in Europe, for example, Italy, is thinking about also to ban the growing of cultivated meat. What do you think about this?
Yeah, unfortunately, alternative proteins have become kind of a victim of the woke, anti-woke kind of debate and sentiment, which is quite unfortunate because it's not helpful for society overall and for our planet in the long run. Specifically for states in the US to ban cultivated meat is going to be very, very difficult for them because the regulation actually occurs at a federal level. It's done by the FDA and the USDA. And once it's approved by the FDA, everybody can market it. And there are no examples at the moment where specific consumer goods are banned from states successfully. So I don't think that legislation can succeed in any way, to be honest. As, by the way, it will happen in Europe. If it's in Europe approved by EFSA, and the EU with a qualified majority adopts it to the market or allows it to the market, Italy can no longer ban it. This will just be impossible.
Another question. What are the countries in which you sold the most of your burgers?
Oh, we haven't sold a lot of we haven't sold any burgers yet because we still need approval. But I think currently probably Singapore is the country where most cultivated meat products are have been sold because they started to approve this in back in 2020, so already 4 years ago.
Mhm. And what do you think it could be the impact of cultural meat in restaurant businesses?
Yeah, I think what we have seen from high-end restaurants, and maybe not so surprising, but a lot of enthusiasm from high-end restaurants. This also has to do, it's novel, it's exciting, and it gives a lot of possibilities. So for high-end restaurants, it has been sort of a magnet. We have no trouble finding Michelin star chefs to rally behind this. Um, this may be helpful because some of them are influencers, and so it may actually be helpful that that happens. Um, I'm more kind of a down to earth person, and I would like this to be a commodity, not a specialty thing. So I would I would be really excited if tomorrow McDonald's says, "Okay, we're going to
Yeah.
we're going to sell cultivated meat."
Yeah, right. And regarding food safety, I mean, what research do you think, is being developed to ensure that the alternative proteins products are safe and nutritious?
Yeah, a lot actually. So the novel food regulation is quite specific, the guidelines that all the things that you have to prove as a producer to the composition, the way it's being produced, the shelf life, all those type of things are quite elaborate. And so I think, and quite honestly, but that's obviously I'm somewhat biased, but I'm also highly informed. I cannot really think and see any issues with it from a safety point of view. I'm also a medical doctor by training, so I am quite concerned about this, but I don't see any real issues here. Thinking of how it's being produced, what the ingredients here, I cannot really see an issue. Nevertheless, it's good that there are independent agencies that really check, do you analyze, did you analyze everything that you should analyze? Yeah, and is that all according to the standards and regulations? That's the level you can deal with that. There is currently no other, and I think it's good. That's the way we admit stuff to our market. But there's no other way. This is what it is.
Okay. One more. When do you think we will have a cultivated steak in the supermarket in Europe? What question?
Yeah. Well, there are three there are three questions here: steak, um, Europe, and supermarket. So for a steak, well, I'm not sure what is meant by a steak, but if a hamburger is meant by a steak or something like, when I think about a steak, it's a filet mignon or a ribeye or a whole cut piece of tissue. Um, that will take a while because that's additional technology. I think we see some whole cuts coming up now, but it's very, very slow and very limited. It will be difficult to scale up and to make it cost effective, so more difficult than for hamburgers. It's doable, but it will take longer. I would think to get to price parity with a full thickness product, it's at least another 10 years before we are there with a full thickness product. And then, of course, Europe there are no products approved in Europe yet. So Europe is, and it takes 2 years, actually a year and a half in Europe to approve a product. So even hamburgers, even expensive hamburgers, we are not going to see in the next 2 years in Europe. It's just not going to happen. After that, I think it will, but then it will be still hamburgers at relatively small scale and somewhat expensive.
Okay. From the same animal, say cow, for example, you can cultivate cells of the animal, so you get different kinds of cultivated product?
In theory, yes. We have done quite a bit of research in this. Different strains of animals, different parts of the animal from the butt or from the shoulder or from the side, from males and from females. So we have gone older, younger animals. So we've gone through a lot of varieties. Some of those differences you lose when you start to culture cells because they're all in the same environment. They are treated exactly the same, so they're all in the same environment. So some of that variety you actually lose during culture.
And would it be possible to apply the same technology to produce fish protein?
Yes, and it is being done. Of those 150 companies that I showed, roughly 20 or so are working on either fish, shellfish, octopus. So there's a lot of different varieties. Essentially, the technology is the same. As long as you can identify the cells that can divide and make muscle tissue, you can do that for any species that you like. But fish is for sure a big target. Yeah.
Okay. Is there any difference among countries with regards to incentives at the government level?
Yes, there is. Even also at a sort of a European level, but within there are a couple of countries that have incentivized quite a bit. Norway, Korea, Japan, the US to some degree, the Netherlands relatively late, but now with the largest amount ever. So there is gradually, and this is actually a very good thing because I strongly feel that this needs to be publicly funded because of the importance for environment and for animal welfare and so forth. So I strongly feel it needs to be publicly funded. But it has taken quite a while before that started. And the EU now also has picked up. But there is quite a big difference between countries, yes.
Okay, there are a lot of questions, so we could keep go on, and we can't. Just to say you totally thank you so much for joining to this webinar, all your help and collaboration with us. It's a real pleasure. So muchas gracias a todos por asistir a este evento, a este webinar. El próximo que tenemos, que está en nuestra web, lo tendremos dentro de 15 días, donde seguiremos hablando, en ese caso va a ser sobre inteligencia artificial y salud. Muchísimas gracias a todos y bienvenidos a un nuevo, y gracias por haber asistido. Thank you so much, Mark. See you next time.
Welcome.
Bye.
Welcome. Have a great day. Bye.
You too. Bye.